and I met 23 years ago now, and our first novel, Dune House Atreides, was published in 1999. And there's a lot of activity surrounding that again. So it's like Dune House Atreides Redux plus the Dune Redux. But Dune is such a fantastic, huge universe that there's plenty of places for Kevin and I to play in the sand.
Well, and under normal circumstances, I'm sure most people have heard about the large legendary film adaptation of Dune by Denis Villeneuve with an all-star cast, and then there's a spin-off TV series in the works. But that is in a different situation just because of the pandemic and filming and theaters. But the cool thing is that all of our publishing work is still going on like crazy. So we've got a lot of great projects that we want to talk about, including a brand new book, the first one in a trilogy called The Duke of Caladan. Brian, you want to give a little rundown on that one?
Yes, we have that book completed and accepted and edited by the publisher. We've reviewed the cover, approved it, and I think Kevin can show that to you. There it is.
Yes.
That has a nice backdrop that is quite different from your normal desert scenes in the Dune series, but this is still very much a Dune story. Dune, the Duke of Caladan. We have 3 novels that will be set basically in Caladan and the ruling Atreides family that lives there. So it's a different focus, but it's a focus on heroes of Dune that all Dune fans are familiar with.
Well, and the story takes place, it's basically the year before Frank Herbert's Dune starts. So it's got all of your familiar characters. It's got Duke Leto and Lady Jessica and Baron Harkonnen and young Paul Atreides and Gurney Halleck and Thufir Hawat and all of the greatest characters that I've ever read in science fiction. But the trilogy will talk about some strife in the Imperium and the struggles with the Baron Harkonnen and House Atreides, and how House Atreides gets control of the spice operations on Dune, which we know doesn't turn out all that well.
Well, when Dune begins, Paul is 15 years old, and we've begun this novel when he's 14, and he gets into a lot of adventures and a lot of challenges for him. By the time Dune begins, when he's 15, he seems a lot more mature than a 15-year-old. He's physically not that large at that time, but the stories that Kevin and I are writing, the trilogy set before Dune, this is the Dune, the Duke of Caladan, and 2 sequels to it, will show you the development of Paul Atreides as a young man, and it'll explain why he is so mature during Dune.
Well, it is kind of the formative adventures and the years that's there. And we felt that this would be a great trilogy to start out with, so that we might get a lot of new readers thanks to the movie. That, in fact, even when David Lynch's movie came out, Frank Herbert's novel Dune became the #1 New York Times bestseller. I think it was 20 years after it originally published, just because the movie brought so many new readers in. And there's kind of a resurgence in Dune interest right now. In fact, our first trilogy, as Brian mentioned before, the House Atreides, House Harkonnen, and House Carino, that's getting a facelift, brand new set of covers from Bantam. I don't have those to show you right this instant, but there's that. Frank Herbert's original books have beautiful new editions from Penguin Random House. And another big project that Brian and I have is with Abrams Books. We're doing an actual scene-by-scene accurate adaptation of Frank Herbert's novel Dune as a graphic novel.
And behind Kevin is part of that cover. Do you want to reveal the rest of it?
I'll share the screen and show the cover of that.
There it is.
Is that on there? Okay.
Yeah.
So that is by Bill Sienkiewicz, comics legend Bill Sienkiewicz. This is volume 1 of the graphic novel. And for those of you who have read Frank Herbert's Dune, and of course you all have, because it's one of the greatest science fiction novels ever, the novel Dune itself is in 3 books, part 1, part 2, and part 3. So the graphic novel is going to be like that as well, 3 separate volumes. We've already finished the script for volume 2. This one, volume 1, comes out in, I think, November this year. And if you can see here on the
Zubin,
cover,
are you on push to talk?
Bill Sienkiewicz is going to make a beautiful triptych that all 3 of the covers will line up together so that they form one continuous painting.
Yes, and that's a very, very literary, very scholarly way to look at it. And Dune is a very scholarly universe.
Well, and we should acknowledge that the illustrators inside are Raul Allen and Patricia Martin, Spanish artists, I believe, and
Yes.
they've done a great job throughout. And we should just mention, because Frank Herbert's book is this huge, huge cast of characters, but it's so dense and there's so much information and politics and background that when you read it, you absorb it all. But converting it to a graphic format, illustrating panel by panel, was quite a challenge to make it visually interesting and convey all that information.
Well, it's a lot of work to convert it to that format. Fortunately, Frank Herbert was, among other things, a professional photographer. So he once told me that he looks at scenes through the lens of a camera, and you'll see him describing certain things, such as the Baron Harkonnen would start with features of the Baron, but he doesn't quite go to the entire Baron. But then you get the personality of the Baron in the opening scene of Dune, and he's just kind of gradually opening up like a camera lens. And I think it's a beautiful way that Frank Herbert did that particular scene, the first one with the Baron, but also just he was very visual in the way he set up his scenes. So he not only could leave you on a cliffhanger as far as the action goes, but visually he presented it in such a way that he left all of us with images and memories of various characters. But we also had these incredible images. I had somebody tell me when I was in my 20s, he said he just read Dune and he actually got thirsty reading the book. So that's pretty good descriptive abilities by Frank Herbert. I mean, he was quite a genius, and Kevin and I have worked hard to maintain the quality that he established.
Well, and I'm going to kind of throw you a bone here, because I want you to talk. Brian wrote this amazing biography of his father called Dreamer of Dune, which is, I told him, I guess it was sort of a backhanded compliment. I said, I don't normally like to read biographies, but this one is really good. And I enjoyed it so much. But Brian dug up so many details about his father, and it's a book about growing up with his father and kind of watching his creative genius. And you told us a story about how you heard your dad reading something to your mom, and it turned out it was part of Dune. Can you tell us that?
We were living on Potrero Hill in San Francisco in the early 1960s, and we had one of those walk-up flats. We were on the 3rd level, and so you'd walk up this long flight of stairs to get to our flat. And it was one of those places where if somebody rang the doorbell down below on the street, you would, look at them through the curtain, and then you'd hit a buzzer, and they would come in and then start traipsing up the stairs. Well, we had a small dining room up there, and we were lower middle class, and so there were a lot of economic challenges for us. But I remember sitting in that dining room, and my father would have his manuscript on the table, and he was reading passages to my mother. And she was giving him feedback. And one of the passages I remember is Paul Atreides and his Gom Jabbar test. And that really got my attention. It was so suspenseful. And my father and I had not been getting along well when I was growing up. I was a little bit boisterous, as he was when he was a child. In fact, I think the child when Frank Herbert was 9 years old, he was so boisterous and so much like an adult in many ways. But he went around with a backpack with the complete work of Shakespeare when he was 9. He would get in a rowboat and go all the way up to Southeast Alaska, being pulled by barges. I mean, he was an adventurer, and so here he was in San Francisco reading a manuscript to my mother. And at the time, I really wasn't getting along with him. So it gave me a little insight into his personality, and it was quite memorable to hear that. But he and I did not really get along until I was a young adult. So that's what Dreamer of Dune is largely about. It's three stories. It's me getting to know this complex man who was obviously a genius, but he didn't let my brother or me into his study. And his study is where he created these characters, Paul Atreides and all the others. And so these were actually our competition. He seemed to spend a lot more time with those characters than he did with us when I was growing up. And he seemed quite a disciplinarian. So one of the parts of Dreamer of Dune is me trying to understand this complex man, and eventually I did. And I started to understand him when my mother became terminally ill. When I was in my early 20s, my mom got lung cancer, and my father did everything you could imagine in order to save her life. He was her hero. He stepped in and did everything possible for her, as I wrote about in the book, and he actually extended her life for 10 years beyond what was expected by the doctors. So when I saw this heroic action by Frank Herbert, by this man that I had had a lot of difficulty with, he and I suddenly became best friends. We wrote a book together. We talked about other projects together. And we were literally the best of friends when I was a young adult. So there's the love story of my parents that brought my father and me together. And then third, of course, the third big thread of Dreamer of Dune is the origins of the ideas that Frank Herbert put into Dune, how he grew up in a socialist community near Tacoma, Washington. It had once been a community that was actually had its own money, had its own cigar factory, its own businesses, and it was socialist. And it kind of fell apart. And so by the time my father lived there, it was called Burley, Washington. By the time my father lived there in the early 1920s, it had it was just the remnants of what had been a society that was working. And so he grew up in all this immersion with politics and people talking about what it used to be like and why the whole project fell apart. So he had an early understanding of what worked politically and what didn't. And a lot of that went into Dune. So you'll see a lot of warnings about politicians in Dune. Not only the ecological message that we all are so familiar with, but there's political messages, religious messages, and the great adventure story of Paul Atreides, which is a classic adventure.
Well, and if I remember right, that after publishing Dune, John W. Campbell was his editor at Analog Magazine. And of course, he was sort of being pressured to write a sequel to Dune. And so he delivers Dune Messiah, which is about basically the great hero with feet of clay, this terrible guy who was a hero who turns into a tyrant. And John W. Campbell just hated that's not what he wanted, or further adventures of the hero Paul Atreides. But Frank didn't want that. He wanted to show the dangers of a charismatic leader.
Yeah, my dad felt that my dad was a Republican all his life, which surprises a lot of people. He was a Republican speechwriter in the 1950s for candidates that were well known. A U.S. senator, a sitting U.S. senator, Frank Herbert, was a speechwriter. Frank Herbert lived in Washington, D.C. for a while. But he, I think we're going to have to edit this part.
Take a breath and then just start all over again.
Yeah, what was the train of thought there?
He wrote for speech writing for a Republican. Just say that your dad was a Republican and just go from there. Surprises people.
Well, it surprises people that Frank Herbert was a Republican when he had such an ecological message in Dune. But Frank Herbert was also a professor at the University of Washington in Seattle. And he would get involved in anti-war protests. He marched down the freeway, took over the freeway, and he was marching with students. But this was a Republican. So Frank Herbert wrote speeches for Guy Cordon, who was a sitting U.S. senator from Oregon. But Guy Cordon was the kind of senator that would reach across the aisle. He knew Truman, and Dad would be sitting in there talking to Guy Cordon in Washington D.C., and in would walk Harry Truman. So he had a lot. Frank Herbert had a lot of exposure to political concepts, to political ideas, starting with Burley, Washington, the ex-socialist community, going through as a speechwriter, being in Washington, D.C., being in the Library of Congress. In the old days, when you were researching something, and he did a lot of research for speeches, in the old days, they would bring you carts of books and surround you at your library table with carts. And it's a little different now, a little easier. But Dad developed a method of writing speeches for Guy Cordon and for other Republican candidates. And Dad called it concentric circles, in which he could write a short version of a speech, a particular topic. He would write a medium length version and a longer version. So Kevin and I do that when we answer questions. We have our short version, our medium version, and we could talk for hours about all this, but we don't have time to do it.
And now we've just gotten all three versions. I'm going to throw one more Frank Herbert thing because I think it's really interesting. Why don't you tell us about They Stopped the Moving Sands, sort of like the vision that started all of Dune, because I love that story.
Well, among other things, Frank Herbert was a reporter and a feature writer for various newspapers on the West Coast of the United States, Hearst papers. And at one point, he was writing a freelance story, and he had heard about this project on the Oregon coast near Florence, Oregon. And it was a project in which the U.S. Department of Agriculture had managed to stop big sand dunes on the coast from encroaching on highways. And they did it by planting what they called poverty grasses on the slip faces of the dunes. And this project was worldwide known, and people would come from Chile, from other parts of the world to see what was going on. And then Frank Herbert flew down there from the Seattle area in a small plane, and he flew over this area. And I think the romantic version is that as he flew over this area to look at the dunes, the romantic version is that he had his full image of Paul Atreides in the desert and all this stuff. No, he didn't have it then. But he started to write a magazine article about this project, this amazing scientific project. And by the time he got back to Seattle and Tacoma, where we live, he started to realize he had a bigger project than just a magazine article. In fact, he sent the magazine article and all the photos in to his agent to see if he could sell it, as a small piece. And it was turned down by everybody, of course. Frank Herbert was used to that. He had so many rejections. Even Dune itself was rejected as a novel 23 times. But anyway, Frank Herbert eventually, the project was turned down as a magazine. He called it They Stopped the Moving Sands, which is, an interesting title. It was rejected, not commercial. Frank Herbert was not commercial. That was many of the rejections that he received. Whatever he wrote didn't quite fit the media. If he wanted to do something for Saturday Evening Post or Life magazine or Collier's or anything else, whatever he sent in wasn't the right length. It wasn't the right subject. I mean, he has so many rejection letters, and Kevin can talk more about the rejections of the novel. But he realized in the midst of the rejections on his magazine article that this was something much bigger. And he started to have these images of a story set in a landscape on the desert. And he laid out this novel, which he called Spice Planet, which was a very rudimentary version of what we all know in Dune. And it had a house like the Harkonnens and like the Atreides, but under different names. There was a Duke Leto, but under a different name. And they were competing. And the novel basically, by the end of it, it's whoever gets the most spice wins the game. Well, Kevin and I wrote that novel, and we actually found Frank Herbert's notes, which was interesting. So Frank Herbert went from They Stopped the Moving Sands to Spice Planet, and then eventually he wrote Dune. And Dune took 5 years, from about 19 1958 to 1963 to at least get it into a form where it could be serialized in analog. And as Kevin mentioned earlier, John W. Campbell was Frank Herbert's editor on those projects. So there's a lot of letters going back and forth between the two of them. And Campbell wanted really strong heroes. He didn't like, as Kevin said, he didn't like the clay feet aspect. But Dad admired heroes, but he thought they were dangerous. He thought John Kennedy was an admirable person, even though he was a Democrat and Dad didn't care much for the Kennedys. But Dad warned that following a person like him that was so charismatic, that we could follow that charismatic leader off the edge of a cliff. And so that's what the warning is in Dune Messiah. You don't want to follow these leaders without question. You want to question them.
Well, and we published at Wordfire Press a bunch of Frank's unpublished stories because he had written things that he never could get published. And exactly what you just said, Brian, he was writing like 20,000 word stories, which is, nobody writes a 20,000 word story. It's too long to be a short story and it's too short to be a novel, and no magazine's going to give up like 30 pages in the magazine for it. So we had all those.
He picked any subject he wanted.
And and that goes to Dune itself. Dune itself was like an unpublishable novel because at the time, nobody published 500-page science fiction books. They published like the little 200-page things. So, but we're glad that he had his own vision and did whatever he wanted to do because we've all benefited from it.
Well, maybe we should mention, since I mentioned the heroes of Dune that Frank Herbert wrote about, there's another unsung hero of Dune, or he hasn't been sung about very much. Sterling Lanier was an editor at Chilton Books, and Chilton published these huge, like Rambler auto repair manuals and Ford auto repair manuals and Chevrolet and all this stuff. And Sterling Lanier was an editor at this publishing company in Philadelphia that wrote these huge books. But Sterling Lanier was also a science fiction fan, and he'd written some couple of novels himself. And he actually tracked Frank Herbert down when he heard about this novel Dune. And Sterling Lanier, after all the rejections of Dune as a novel, Sterling Lanier tracked him down and actually got it published in book form by Chilton. And Chilton didn't publish science fiction. They just published big auto repair manual books. But this book was big. So that fit right in. It was a big doorstopper of a book, just like their auto repair manuals.
I didn't know that Sterling actually tracked it down. I thought Frank's agent sent it there because he had sent it every place else. So Sterling found out about it and just...
Yeah, he put on his Sherlock Holmes hat. But he was in the publishing business, so he heard about this thing. And he probably might even gotten a copy of it, but he was definitely tracking. He was on the trail.
Good. Well, we've got some of those. In fact, the book Brian was talking about, Spice Planet, the sort of the proto version of Dune. We published that in a collection called The Road to Dune. And there were some of the notes for They Stopped the Moving Sands in there. And also some of the rejection slips from Dune, that there was, what did somebody say that this may be the greatest mistake I've ever made in rejecting Frank Herbert's Dune, but I just can't get through the first 100 pages without being annoyed with my own work.
That's right. He said, this editor said, I may be making the mistake of my career in rejecting Dune, but I have to reject it.
Yeah. Well, what I remember, I mean, I wanted to be a science fiction writer since I was a little kid, and I grew up reading. I read H.G. Wells and The War of the Worlds, and I read Andre Norton and all these things. But as I started to get to know more about science fiction, everybody was saying, well, you got to read Dune. You have to read Dune. But it was like scary. It's this big, fat book. And I was just like 10 or 11 years old. But I've got a copy of the old Ace paperback that has this giant cartoon sandworm on the front cover that's chasing after people or something. And I thought, all right, well, if it's got giant monsters in it, I'll read it. And I read it when I was like 10 or 11. And I loved it because I read it as an adventure story of, Paul Atreides being stranded out in the desert and riding sandworms. And I thought this was a great book. And then I read it again when I was in college. And suddenly I read all of the politics and religion and the ecology stuff, which had just kind of gone over my head the first time. And I find that I keep reading it and I keep getting more stuff out of it. But Frank, I not just Dune, I read all of his other books, The God Makers and Soul Catcher and The Heaven Makers and Dosadi Experiment and just all of these books. And he was a big influence on me. And when I was writing what turned out to be my very first novel called Resurrection Inc., I was going to make up my mind. I was going to mail Frank Herbert the very first copy of my book when it finally came out. And in fact, I joined Science Fiction Writers of America because they had a membership directory, and I had Frank Herbert's home address, and I'm working on my book, and I was gonna send him the very first copy, but he passed away before it got published. So I was never able to connect with him. But Brian, you're one of my best friends, so I guess that's the next best thing. I can't complain too terribly much.
Well, I was not really immersed in reading science fiction as a young man. And when the literature that interested me, I was interested in things like Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. And so that did touch on science fiction. And but I like the satire. I like the satirical approach to talking about society and situations such as Evelyn Waugh's The Loved One and things like that. So when I started writing, I wrote an entire novel. I was in my early 30s when I wrote my first attempt, or with my first attempt. My father looked at it and he said, "Well, you've got some good writing here. You've got a good style. I see some good action going on. But have you seen such and such?" And I said, "What do you mean, have I seen such and such?" Well, he referred me to this movie, and there was this science fiction movie that I hadn't even seen the movie or read the book. And he said, "Take a look at that." So I took a look at it, and sure enough, there was my story, Parallel Evolution, already in a movie. Maybe I'd absorbed it or heard about it or whatever, but by not being immersed in the industry, I was not familiar consciously with that story. So I then rewrote it again, and I came up with this novel, Sydney's Comet, which is a satirical story. And it's about this society of overconsumption in which even garbage is catapulted into outer space, and bodies are catapulted into outer space. There's really no room for that stuff on the planet. There's too many people, and there's just too much consumption. And it's definitely a satire. And I got a great review from Publishers Weekly right off the bat that I have a dark wit. So I brought that dark wit to this project with Kevin. And so some of the strange characters that you see in these stories, some of them come from Kevin, but some of them have come from me too. But we have a similar writing style. So even though Kevin brings his physics background to our projects, and I bring my sociology degree from Berkeley and my other background to these projects, we found a way to work together, and it's great that our styles are so similar.
I guess it's better than Publishers Weekly saying that one of us has a dim wit instead of the dark wit.
It was a fine first novel, and I have a dark wit, so there it is.
Well, and Brian and I, it was like 23 years ago that we first got in touch, and we talked on the phone after I'd written you a letter, and we sort of had kind of dancing around the edges, but we just really connected right away about our excitement for Dune and our vision for it. And
we met on the phone. We had long phone conversations to start.
It's first time that Brian called me up, and my wife was in the room just listening, and we started talking, and before long I'm starting to riff off of these obscure Hellstrom's Hive and the Destination Void and all these other Frank Herbert stuff. And my wife says, after 10 minutes, you guys just started speaking a different language. We were finishing each other's sentences. And
well, it's just a little backstory there. Kevin sent me a letter, and I actually sat on that letter for about a month, and I did a little research. Kevin's letter suggested writing a new novel in the series, and I believe he suggested that he could write it by himself, or I don't have the letter in front of me. We should pull that out, Kevin. That'd be interesting. But I did a little research on Kevin. And I was I didn't find anybody that said anything bad about Kevin. I knew a lot of people in the science fiction community at that point because I was writing novels in that genre, and nobody said anything bad about Kevin. And he's just a terrific writer. He's a bundle of energy. He's like a young Frank Herbert. And so I met Kevin when he was in his 30s. This bundle of energy, and but I didn't reply to that letter for about a month. Maybe maybe because I wasn't quite ready to think about writing new stories in the Dune universe. I knew that if anybody wrote in the Dune universe, I wanted to do it. I wanted to be involved in it. In fact, my father and I talked about continuing the series, but he passed away. But I knew that I should return that phone call. I sensed I sensed something, and sure enough, the minute we started talking, we hit it off, and we were just throwing ideas back and forth, plot ideas and amazing stuff, and we were going to write about this, and we're going to write about that, and there was so much energy flying around that Kevin's wife noticed it on the other end of the line. And when Kevin flew up to Seattle in May of 1997, this is a couple of months after we started talking on the phone, we started talking. I picked him up at the airport, and at that time I was driving Frank Herbert's old Mercedes. I had that, and I picked Kevin up in that car. And I no longer
you had you had a photocopy of an author photo from the back of a paperback book of mine. You're wandering around the airport with this photo of me like I'm a missing kid or something like that, and you found me.
So anyway, I picked you up in this old diesel car, not environmentally pure, by the way, but at least, as Dad said, you don't have to keep remanufacturing a car, which uses a lot of energy because it was an old Mercedes. But anyway, I picked Kevin up in this, and we started talking, and there were so many ideas going, and I started finding myself in the Dune universe instead of on the highway. And I kind of swerved a little bit and got back in the lane, and Kevin's over there reaching for his tape recorder and notes, and there's just so much stuff flying. We couldn't keep it all in our heads. We had to get it down in a tape recorder or on paper.
And when I came home from that, like 3 or 4 days, whatever that trip was, I think my brain was just wrung out, and I just slept for a day. I was so exhausted.
And that is not an easy thing to do, to wring Kevin's brain out.
Well, but that resulted in, what we wanted to do was to finish Frank Herbert had finished Chapter House Dune, but that story ends on a cliffhanger. So he had more in the story that he wanted to tell, but the pancreatic cancer had gotten him too quickly for him to finish it. So that was our original idea, to finish it up, but we decided to tell a prequel first, the House Atreides series.
Right, and one of the reasons I delayed calling Kevin back is that in part of my mind and emotionally, I felt like Frank Herbert's series should end with Chapter House Dune. Even though there was an unwritten Dune 7 that was the sequel, and there were notes that Frank Herbert wrote to Dune 7, but he passed away before writing them. But there's an incredible tribute to my mother at the end of Chapter House Dune. It's about their life together, and she died in Hawaii while Dad was writing that book. And this incredible tribute to Beverly Herbert is at the end of Chapter House Dune. And they were a writing team. My mother, in fact, when they met at the University of Washington in 1945, 1946, they were in a writing class at the University of Washington, and they were the only two people in the class that had sold a story. My mother had sold a story to a romance magazine, and my dad had sold an adventure story to an Alaska magazine. And so here was the adventure and the romantic, and they were the only two, hopefully, other than the professor, that had published anything. And they just hit it off immediately. And so in the early 1950s, my mother actually gave up her creative writing attempts, and she supported our family by writing advertising copy for department stores, Macy's and others. And the White House in San Francisco was a big department store downtown. My mom wrote the ads for these department stores. She supported our family. She was our breadwinner, while the genius Frank Herbert didn't always have a job. He worked in newspapers off and on. He didn't always have a job, but she was a writer and he was a writer. And in fact, when they were married, they honeymooned up a place called Kelly Butte, and they took two typewriters up to the top of this to this forest lookout, and they were up there for the season watching for fires, but they each had a typewriter. So they were both writers. And when Dad wrote that incredible tribute to Beverly Herbert, who died in 1984 in Hawaii, I thought emotionally the series maybe should end right there. But I knew logically there were other stories to tell, and Frank Herbert had even outlined a big one that Kevin and I ultimately wrote as Hunters of Dune and Sandworms of Dune. Those comprise Dune 7. So there's a lot that goes into the Dune universe. It's not all logic. There's a lot of emotion in there as far as creating these projects. But I'm really happy that Kevin and I were able to find a way to work together, do these projects, and just get along so incredibly well for more than 20 years.
Still, man. Well, we should go over a little bit about how we actually work together, because we're just about to start actual work on The Lady of Caladan, which is the follow-up to The Duke of Caladan. And now we're going to have to modify it just because I can't get on a plane and fly up there and spend some days with you because we're all kind of stuck at home, but we'll do it by Zoom. But what we normally do is I will fly up and I'll spend a few days with Brian in his guest bedroom, and we'll just spend the days. We'll walk around some of the parks or along the beach, and we just brainstorm. We know the book we're going to write. I mean, this one's book 2 in our trilogy. We have a good idea for what's going on, but then we just brainstorm the whole plot chapter by chapter and character arcs, and it goes on and on, usually about 3 days until we've hammered out the basic outline. And as we're sitting there together, we kind of write up the bullet points of the 100 chapters or however many we're going to put into the book. And after we've got the story outlined, and because it's a Dune book, there's all kinds of different point of view characters and different settings. And after we've got the, say, 100 pages or 100 chapters outlined, then Brian and I do like our horse trading. Like, I want this character and he wants that character. And then we divide it up so that we each write half the chapters. It is a full-on collaborative thing that Brian writes half of them and then I write half of them.
And actually we have like 15 Dune novels now. One of those novels, I will not reveal the title, we actually reversed roles, and I took the writing projects that Kevin normally would have taken, and he took mine.
Yeah.
So we did a little switcheroo on that one, and we're not going to reveal which one it is.
Yep. Well, and then so then we write. I write the first draft of my chapters, and he writes the first draft of his, and then we polish them a little bit, and then we swap so that I rewrite all of his chapters and he rewrites all of my chapters, and we fit them together, and it goes back and forth for 5 times, 6 times. I think the Machine Crusade had like 13 different drafts by the time we got done with it.
Yeah, and in House Atreides we have like eight storylines, 8 major storylines going, and that was our first novel.
And by the time we get done with it, it really is pretty seamless, because Brian's edited out anything that doesn't sound like him, and I've edited out anything that doesn't sound like me. And
Kevin blows, with his science background, Kevin blows up planets. And with my sociology background, I try to, can't we all get along, try to put things back together.
So we have it, and we do like all the world building and stuff. And in fact, I should mention, because after we had done, I don't know, I think 10 Dune novels, we decided we really liked working together, and we knew what we were doing as co-authors. And so we did our own original trilogy that's also big galactic empire, big science fiction. That's called the Hellhole trilogy, Hellhole and Hellhole Awakening and Hellhole Inferno. And we did those 3 books. And I mention all that because where NASFiC is going to be having a connection to one of my local bookstores, and you guys can buy autographed copies of some of our titles, and that trilogy is one of them.
Well, it's kind of a simple way to think about Hellhole, and it's pretty complex. It's 3 novels. Think about Napoleon being exiled to Elba or Saint Helena, to one of these islands. Well, we have a character who's exiled to the worst planet imaginable, and it's a planet hellhole. And the imperial government that sends him there expects him to die there. No, he doesn't die there. He becomes tougher there and more dangerous there. So we use a little bit of history, because Kevin and I both like to read history, and then we extrapolated, which is what you do in science fiction, and we created this huge, incredible universe.
Well, and he's our hero. So he's a
Yes.
little different from Napoleon, but he's our hero, and he keeps the colonists alive. And then of course they discover the remnants of an alien race that used to live there. And then the corrupt imperial government wants to have the planet back, but the colonists don't want to give it back. And it's very complicated over 3 books. So we've got all of those. So we just enjoy writing together. We took the Duke of Caladan, which comes out in October. Is our first Dune book in, I think it was 5 years since when we actually wrote Navigators of Dune, which was the previous one. So we took a little bit of break to recharge our batteries, and we were diving in, and I'm getting ready to start Zooming and brainstorming with you to do book 2.
Well, wait, when you mentioned those aliens, I mean, that sounds interesting. They resurrected some aliens in our story. Well, guess what? They were thought to not be alive, and somehow they come back to life. And could they have military capabilities? I wonder. Better take a peek at that one.
Some interesting alien civilizations. I think we have a really cool thing there with, I think it was called Slickwater, about how they stored their entire culture and civilization and this stuff bubbling up from the ground. So we love doing those books. That's a trilogy, and I know science fiction fans are going to love to hear this. And it's all done. You can get all 3 books. You have to wait for the next one. So that's there.
Well, I hope it comes across that Kevin and I have fun with these projects. We really do. And I've forgotten whether it was the first, second, or third book that we were writing, but we had this scene that we had outlined in which our characters are in trouble in outer space on a Highliner. And I was expected to write that scene. And so I wrote it. And then as far as they got trapped out there, and the navigator is dead, and this huge Highliner is trapped in outer space with our heroes on it. And I just kind of ended it, and I said, now, I think it was at the outline form maybe where I did that. But I said, Kevin, here's this scene here's this scene where they're all trapped out there. Now you figure out how to get them out of it.
Well, fortunately, that didn't escalate. I could have done that to you back and forth, and then it would have been a mess. But no, I guess that's something else to point out, that we really do outline very well, very carefully ahead of time, because these books are very complicated, and some writers, they like to do it. They're called pantsers. They, by the seat of their pants, they like to make it up as they go along. And that, I guess that works great if you're one writer, but Brian and I have to hand off chapters back and forth, and my one chapter has to end where his starts. And
well, so one of the surprises in Dune, the Duke of Caladan, I wrote a scene where Paul is stressed, and so Kevin didn't know how I was going to write that. And so when I sent it back to him, Kevin was very complimentary of the stressful situation I put him in. But on the other hand, I try to compliment Kevin just as much. But Kevin had no idea what stress Paul was going to be put into, and it worked.
We locked him in a box of spiders. No, we didn't do that.
Now, you notice that I'm not doing too many spoilers. And early on, when we were doing interviews and things, I think I dropped a few spoilers. I try to avoid that now, but I'm the one that's prone to it. I'm very prone, so you could get.
Well, and I guess what you have to realize is that by the time these books come out, we've gone over them 10 times, and it's been a year ago that we started writing it. So it's brand new, exciting stuff. And but for us, we're on to the next book and the next book.
Well, Kevin, you're also a publisher. You have Wordfire Press, and you published a lot of Frank Herbert's novels. Actually, there were notes that we found. Some of them were complete novels that were rejected. Some were unusual lengths. But Kevin has not only published some Frank Herbert novels, including some that went out of print and were published earlier, but he and I have written a number of Dune short stories. And so Kevin has compiled those into what's called Tales of Dune. Kevin is also the UK publisher for, is it House Atreides? Is it all three of those books, Kevin?
All three in ebook form.
Yeah, in ebook form in the United Kingdom.
And navigators.
And we have another project that he'll be publishing in the Dune universe in the United Kingdom.
Well, and we're gonna wrap up in just a little bit here, but I want to show off a couple of my solo projects that we're doing, and then Brian can talk about some of his. And since Brian talked about my Wordfire Press, this is a book that I just released that I edited with a bunch of grad students. I should mention that I'm also a professor at Western Colorado University, and I teach a master's degree in publishing. And my students put together an anthology called Monsters, Movies, and Mayhem that they did all the editing. They read the slush pile, they designed the cover, they designed the interior of the book, they released it, they're marketing it, and Wordfire Press published it. So that one just came out. That's a bunch of wonderful little creepy things.
And how did you do the artwork on that? That's interesting. You did the film on the side there.
Well, that was we poured through a bunch of stock art services where we could look at different images that we could get the rights to. And that one, I turned the students loose. They looked through, well, they didn't look through millions of images, but they had keywords and they searched and they came up with the art that they wanted to do. And that's a book that I'm very proud of doing. And this has been a busy month for me. I've got a couple of other things. This is my big fantasy trilogy. Spine of the Dragon is the first one, and that just came out in trade paperback form. And I've got the second book called Venge War comes out in January, and I'm editing the third book now. So I'm like in different parts of my brain doing different things with that. And because I have all these different projects going on, they're not all the same. They're not all Dune or big science fiction. That one's the Monsters, Movies, and Mayhem was like creepy movie horror stuff. And then Spine of the Dragon is like Game of Thrones, this big, huge epic fantasy. And then last of all, this one just came out 4 days ago. It's called Stake, and it's sort of a serial killer vampire novel where the guy actually believes in vampires, and he's going around killing people that sleep during the day and they work the night shift and they're never seen out in sunlight. And he thinks that he's saving the world from vampires, but it all depends on whether vampires are real or not. Does that mean he's saving humanity, or is he a nutty serial killer? So that's a fun one.
You can see the humor there in what Kevin does. I like your grumpy old monsters too. That was cute.
Yes.
A few years ago.
That was a comic series that I did for IDW. So Brian, why don't you tell us some of your solo projects and
Well, I didn't bring any props, but if you guys all want to search for them, you can search for Dreamer of Dune. But I did publish a couple of novels with a small publisher in the last 2-3 years. One is called The Unborn, and there's a scientific truth where there have been people that have been discovered to have embryos growing out of their shoulders and out of different parts of their body, and it's really strange because it's like a dead human being that comes out of a tumor in your shoulder. This is true stuff, or maybe somebody trumped it up on the internet. I don't know, but anyway, I thought, wow, that's really cool. So I wrote this horror novel called The Unborn, in which you have this character who's somewhat heroic, but he's got, instead of a tumor in his shoulder, he's got a bunch of siblings living and growing inside him while he's alive. And they're causing him trouble, of course, and they want to be born. They're not real happy that he was the one that was born out of all those embryos, and they had to stay in there. So it's all kinds of pandemonium. And that's The Unborn. I had a lot of fun with it. There's some humor and some science in there. Another one is The Assassination of Billy Jeeling. Billy Jeeling is the greatest hero in the history of Earth. He has solved environmental pollution. He has sent these sky miners out to clean all the pollution up. And then he's in this huge, huge floating city that goes over the planet, constantly cleaning the atmosphere. But when it's time for Billy Jeeling to retire and let the government take over this operation, he won't do it. He won't retire. He refuses. And so it's all about the government of Earth trying to get rid of this guy that's become too big for his britches. So a little bit of humor there, science, cleaning the atmosphere, the environment, and of course going back to another book that I think a lot of Dune fans would like to read, Dreamer of Dune. I think you'd like to know the origins of Frank Herbert's ideas, how he grew up, the story of a young man, me, trying to understand a complex man, the love story of my mother and father, both writers, and all the origins of the incredible ideas. So read Dreamer of Dune. I don't like to stand here as a talking head and talk about my book a lot, here, hold it up and do this, but you really should read that even if it's a dog-eared copy that somebody passed on to you and I don't get a royalty on it, read it anyway.
Yeah.
However you can read it.
It is really a great biography, and it helps you understand not just Dune, but Frank Herbert himself. And NASFiC is arranging for us to have signed copies of a bunch of our titles. I'm pretty sure Dreamer of Dune will be there. Also, Brian's novel, The Little Green Book of Chairman Rama, is going to be one of those. A novel called Ocean that he wrote with his wife Jan, that's also one of those. And I'm sure they'll have a link somewhere because I don't know how to tell you to get it, but it's so Brian's sending signed book plates. I'm going to arrange them at the bookstore and I'll do some signing, and you guys can get signed copies as if we were really there in person at NASFiC.
Absolutely. Yeah. Ocean, the creatures in the ocean are tired of us polluting the water. So they rise as a military force to strike the Western civilization, and we have some heroic humans in the group. And so I like to have fun with science and extrapolate and go to the extreme. What could happen? That's what science fiction is all about, and fantasy.
Well, and I think that's pretty much wraps up our hour here. So thank you all for listening. We wish we could be there in person. I hope you enjoy a bunch of the other virtual panels at NASFiC. Brian and I will be paying attention, and we'll join you on some other things. So that's it, I guess. Bye.
Very, very, very nice being with you, even if it had to be in virtual form. We hope to see you in person in the future.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the con.